All right, good afternoon. Welcome to all that are in attendance here at the Command General Staff College and to those watching via the distance learning systems to this presentation of the Command General Staff School and Command General Staff College Foundation's co-sponsored InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series. We're going to recognize a couple folks in attendance. We got the JAMO Director, Colonel Celine, thanks for being here, appreciate it. Several members of the faculty, glad to have you here this afternoon. I'm Rod Cox. I'm with the Command and General Staff College Foundation, and on behalf of my partner, the Command and General Staff School Director, Colonel Tommy Cardoni, and Mr. Marv Nichols, it's our pleasure to present this lecture series to enhance interagency awareness and education. The lecture series is made possible by support to our foundation from the Perot Foundation. Our next brown bag, I'll note, is scheduled for Wednesday, 18 January, discussing the Federal Executive Board. Location will be here in the Arnold Conference Room, same time, 12:30. The Federal Executive Board is an agency, an entity that interagency professionals should be aware of, and we hope you'll plan to join us. Today's presentation will be recorded for use by the distance learning and satellite students, as well as the interagency practitioners that are stationed around the world, and is being live streamed over the Blackboard system of the college. So I ask you, while you engage in conversations or questions with the presenter, that you just come up to where a microphone is. You don't need to turn anything on. The booth will direct that. Just speak, and then you'll hear the microphone pick up your voice. That way, the folks in the outstations will be able to hear what you have to say and contribute to the recording. There are many aspects to American foreign policy. Diplomatic and military efforts readily come to mind as we think of U.S. presence overseas. Often overlooked is a very important aspect of our foreign policy, however. That is the development of partnerships and assistance. With a mission statement, and I'll read in quotes, "On behalf of the American people, we promote and demonstrate democratic values abroad and advance a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. In support of America's foreign policy, the U.S. Agency for International Development leads the U.S. government's international development and disaster assistance through partnerships and investments that save lives, reduce poverty, strengthen democratic governance, and help people emerge from humanitarian crisis and progress beyond assistance." Unquote. We might better realize how important this is if we hear and understand about how USAID promotes America, our democratic values, functioning societies, and peace and prosperity around the world. Today's discussion is designed to do exactly that. We're going to learn about what and how USAID does to further American foreign policy and to foster human dignity around the world. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Mark Sorensen, who is an economic and business development specialist with over 40 years of experience, to include over 20 years with USAID. At USAID, he has served in a variety of supervisory roles and assignments to include duty in Pakistan, Brazil, South Sudan, Iraq, Georgia, Mongolia, and Sri Lanka, as well as in Washington, D.C. While in Iraq from 2009 to 2011, he served on a provincial reconstruction team and directed USAID programs in the Devala province. Prior to his assignment here at the Command and General Staff College, he served as the Supervisory Education Officer in Pakistan, managing USAID's $350 million education portfolio. His language proficiencies include fluency in both Spanish and Portuguese, and Dr. Sorensen holds a doctorate in education from the University of Houston, an MBA from Texas A&M, an MA from University of Florida, a master's in strategic studies from the U.S. Air War College, and a BS and a BA from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. He's the author of several publications and recipient of numerous meritorious honor and exemplary service awards. Please welcome Dr. Mark Sorensen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here. If it works for everybody, I'm just going to walk around a little bit. We have an audience with a lot of direct DoD, USAID, State Department cooperation, collaboration experience. So I would love to just have a dialogue and hear from everybody, but I am going to have to get through my maybe 40 minutes of talk. If anybody has anything burning that they want to communicate while I'm talking, just raise your hand, get my attention, and do so, but I will also try to get through my presentation to get to the most important part, having a dialogue and hearing interesting issues that you ran into, or just questions that my presentation brings up. So really appreciate people coming in on a tough week to do anything extra. You all have so much to do today and this week before the holidays, so thanks. I want to introduce Chris Daly here, one of our 3 USAID students who is doing a thesis. You want to just mention your thesis topic?
Basically DOD and climate change.
Yeah.
That's as far as my title's gotten so far.
Real good. Important topic. Good. And we have 2 other students here in CGSC and the SAMS program. Okay, let's get started. I will talk about what USAID is and does fairly briefly, because most all of you came because you're familiar with USAID or have directly cooperated with us. I'll touch on how USAID initiatives really focus on national security, I would say, in most of our missions around the world, 100+ missions around the world. And I'll get to how we cooperate with DoD and opportunities for cooperation, and then get to questions, okay? Real good. We were established in 1961 by this gentleman, John F., in the Cold War with some anti-communism and build allies around the world objectives. We were put together using some of the methodologies that came out from the Marshall Plan that was, I think now, is definitely now recognized as pretty successful in helping the reconstruction of Europe post-World War II. So we're a 61-year-old agency. His statement there, our efforts are basically to fulfill the responsibility of the world's most prosperous country, helping other countries, but also contribute to reducing the pressure of conflict that's going to cost U.S. more money when we have to get involved in armed combat. Some of the vision of John F. back in '61, which stays active today as our vision. This security strategy is, of course, replaced by the 2022 national strategy that just came out, but I just like the wording here. It gets to the dual nature of USAID's mission, help in other countries develop their systems so that they can develop their health system, education system, agriculture system, governance system, et cetera, help them, but also bring the benefits back to the United States, largely by building trading partners and reducing conflict and insecurity around the world, which then in turn increases security in our homeland. I don't like talking about myself, but I just recently thought back on my career, and these are the principal countries that I worked in, and I realized, I didn't come into USAID thinking I was a national security professional. I didn't enter my career thinking I wanted to work on national security. I wanted to learn about other cultures and contribute to some development problems in other countries. But as I look back at my career, most of my work had direct tie-ins, fundamental objectives of U.S. government foreign policy objectives in the area of national security in one way or another. I'll go by some examples. In Sri Lanka, a country that's, a number of years ago, well, when I was there, it was in a 25-year or something civil war, kind of a powder keg of mix of largely Buddhist Sinhalese, largely Hindu Tamils, and then a minority of Muslim population. And then a lot of colonial inequality of economic opportunities in Sri Lanka. Chris was also an officer in Sri Lanka. Back then, USAID identified as an important objective just increasing the broad economic opportunities for all those 3 groups, and ethnic groups and religious groups. So that's what I worked on with big agriculture programs, and that was the national security link to our work, creating economic opportunities because that was a lead vulnerability of Sri Lanka, a very important country right next to India on the trade lanes of the South India Sea, et cetera. So that was what I was working on there. Went to the forward operating bases, working with the military on agriculture, energy, infrastructure, governance issues there. South Sudan, Chris is also a veteran of working with USAID in South Sudan. I worked in the year after United States and Norway, frankly, helped South Sudan the most become independent of Sudan, which was taking a lot of their oil wealth. And South Sudan's an area, has an area that's tremendously agriculturally productive if it's used well for agriculture. And so we worked on helping the agricultural system, kind of countering some of the tribal conflict pressures of South Sudan and people fighting over resources, water, oil wealth, et cetera. So that, to me, was a direct link to U.S. strategic objectives in oil-rich, newly independent ally South Sudan, newly independent of Sudan, with the dictator Bashir in power at that time, who has been, a long time ago, was found guilty of international war crimes. Then 2 years in Brazil, one of the American government's strategic objectives in Brazil is helping them with climate change issues related to the Amazon, the lungs of the world, they say, right? So USAID has a program there, and that's almost all we do in Brazil, because Brazil's on its feet in development so well. We also help them, Brazil, become a donor to other countries. We help their equivalent of USAID learn how to be a donor agency, a donor country. So that was our American strategic objective that drove my posting there. Study at Alabama in the InterAgency. Pakistan, one last example. Pakistan's second most populous Muslim country, 230 some million, I believe, and a lot of the kids have to go to madrasas because there's no alternative. There's no quality education outside the madrasas, and they get food at the madrasas. So part of our big program there was kind of prevention of violent extremism, giving the young people a more balanced education, alternatives to the madrasa system that can develop extremists out of the very large youth bulge that Pakistan demographics has. And now I'm real happy to be here, faculty, and coordinating with all the interagency team. And sorry, Mr. Rod Cox, I really appreciate this opportunity to be in this interagency Brown-Bag series. Okay, this is where we operate, 100+ countries around the world. You can see that some countries in Latin America have graduated, Argentina, Chile, et cetera, have graduated from our assistance. Brazil would have graduated except for that strategic interest that America has in lending a hand in a small piece of what they do in the conservation of Amazon resources. Of course, we're in much of Africa. In Latin America, you see, we're in Venezuela as a presence country. We don't have a mission office there, but we're there doing programming. Anybody have any question or answer of why USAID would be operating in Venezuela, not a particularly friendly government to ours? Anybody? Just a fun. Supporting the population, right. Exactly. Both answers are exactly right, because we're not giving assistance directly to the Venezuelan government. We're working with civil society, in particular, quite often the media, helping the media represent the interests of the people better, even in that autocratic regime. Okay? So I say that to explain a couple countries that seem a little bit unusual. We're not giving assistance to China, frankly, I think it might be some things like coordinating climate change collaboration, that kind of thing. And a little bit there of activity still in Eastern Europe, very active in Ukraine, of course. We have been very active in big economic growth programs, governance programs, anti-corruption programs in Ukraine since, 91 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And now work a lot with refugees and displaced persons because of the war in Ukraine. Any questions on that important map?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So with especially as China's extending influence in the Southeast Asia region, and we saw the Solomon Islands recently provide some diplomatic kind of pushback resistance. Have we looked at it, is USAID extending in that region as well? I see Africa, which is great, and Central Asia.
Right.
Is there more to come within the Asia-Pacific region?
I have to think a moment. The competition of ideas between China methodologies for giving assistance and American ways of giving assistance is interesting, for one thing. I think overall our presence, our budgets in Asia are pretty stable, and we're in a lot of those islands that you mentioned, so I think pretty stable. Our programs are always in flux as the local country's needs change, as the threats from China or Russia or any other country or climate change or whatever change, we're always changing our programs. So I don't know if I can address that we're not, that I know of, really expanding. We're always expanding in countries that have more of a security threat. Sorry, Chris?
Well, I could talk a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I was involved so a lot of our assistance is run out of the Philippines and to each of the island nations in the Pacific. And I know it's gone under, I was part of the review, and I know it's gone under a review. I don't know, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there's some organizational changes that we're going to be standing up more missions on some of those islands to kind of bring more organizational resources. A lot of times it's a lot about presence too, boots on the ground, being there to shake the hands of the leaders there. And so I know that we are sort of reorienting out of that. And that I did that review maybe last year or so. So needs congressional approval and everything like that. So I don't want to speak it's recording, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But
And some of that growth also related to our need to do more kind of in-country almost for climate change, and as the sea level rise affects those islands disproportionately as well. So, good, thanks.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Sir,
Yeah.
I have a related question. Is China, do they have a USAID equivalent?
Yeah, they do, real government controlled, of course, like ours is.
Right.
In Sri Lanka, I'll just paint kind of a dismal comparison between their aid and our aid. We're there working in agriculture, education, transition of the war fighters in the Civil War, helping them transition to other employment, helping even Tamil Tigers, which is the terrible terrorist group of Sri Lanka during the Civil War. We're helping them transition. We're doing things that should be long-lasting systems development, helping the education system, the workforce development system, economic growth, farming, help it grow. China built, and Chris, I'm sure, went to some event at the Chinese Sri Lankan Conference Center, with Chinese employees, flown in from China. They put up a big structure, which, is visible and seen, but that kind of development diplomacy and I'm painting, an extreme, but that kind of development work can buy friends. It may not do that much long-term for the country. Is that?
Yeah, it does.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. Chris?
I mean, outside of like the Belt Road Initiative sort of programs that they do, I know, like for instance, like they were really big with distributing vaccines during the pandemic, And it's the same as we would do it, from the American people. It's branded and everything, and so that would be the equivalent. I think they actually call it like ChineAid.
Yeah, it's a big endeavor, but different ways of doing things for sure. And I would say,
in terms of they're building amphibs to do HADR missions like us too.
yeah, right. Yeah, interesting competition there. Oh, sorry.
I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole, but to your point, sir, I heard that the aid that they were distributing was not quality aid, and that a lot of the receiving countries were actually upset that like the things they were given didn't do what the Chinese had promised that they would do. Was there any truth to that?
I heard that there was poor quality as well.
Yeah.
But a lot of times this is information. It's the photo op of delivering.
We're helping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were first out of the gate sort of thing. So you think news cycles and things like that. But yeah, I believe there was low quality to what they were delivering.
There's an article in the New York Times just today talking about the Chinese vaccine for COVID is proven in several studies that it's not as effective as the American vaccine. So that's just one particular example of a lower quality.
Yeah, it is a competition of development as a tool. USAID months ago disseminated its 500 millionth COVID vaccine. We're probably up to 750 million, I'm guessing, now worldwide. And yeah, that's an important role for USAID. This is an important depiction of big picture what USAID does, because we are the lead U.S. government agency for two big buckets. You can call it three buckets. One is development assistance, helping the Ministry of Agriculture in South Sudan develop an extension service, an irrigation system throughout the country, whatever, helping the health system of Pakistan and Afghanistan hopefully wipe out polio once and for all, that kind of thing. But helping them develop those systems is the big bucket there, kind of long-term work, improving conditions in these countries. Then the other two or one bucket here is humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. Humanitarian assistance, think when things get so dire, for example, that people in South Sudan need food aid, that much of a drought and worsened by conflict between tribes happens in South Sudan. That's humanitarian assistance. We use the term in a more focused way than the military does, humanitarian assistance. The military uses HA for a lot of different things. We focus on those short-term, get help to the people that are truly, direly in need immediately right now. And then I also kind of differentiate these two a little bit. Disaster relief being then, the man-made conflicts and wars and extremism, violence, and et cetera, that are man-made disasters around the world, and the naturally caused disasters, tsunamis, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes around the world. Everybody knows FEMA here in America, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which handles disaster response for the 50 states of America. When disasters happen abroad, especially people that have been abroad, are familiar with OFDA, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and that's who's the lead on disaster response. Of course, the military is huge in most disaster response with the trucks, the boats, the planes that can get the tents and food and water to where it's needed, clear the roads, and maintain security. So of course, disaster response, disaster relief, USAID is recognized as the lead, but in almost all cases, it's done, especially in the initial months of any disaster, in close coordination with DoD partners. So those are one way of looking at our whole universe of what we do. This is another one. Around the exterior circle is a little bit more specific buckets of what we do, okay? When we're working on HIV/AIDS in Africa and other places with the PEPFAR program created by George Bush, when we're doing agriculture and food security throughout Asia and a lot of Latin America and Africa. You know, those are a little bit more specific buckets of what we focus on. All of these are figured out in cooperation with the local government, and all of those are kind of an agreement of what the local nation asks for and what the U.S. government says, yeah, that's in your interest and our interest, and let's fund that work together. In most cases with significant buy-in from the local government, local meaning the national, because we've learned in development, in the profession of development, not to invest without local commitments and some planning for sustainability for the long term. Right? So those are the things that we work on. Climate change is becoming increasingly important because it affects economic growth of the countries that we're in. It affects water security that can drive now. You know, people are talking about the first wars that were caused or heavily influenced by climate change. Quite often, you know, having to do or influenced by the vulnerability of water insecurity. So that's what we do. This is how we do it. When people think of USAID, I hope people think we are not a giveaway organization. We are not overseas giving US money away. We don't airlift a whole bunch of tractors, again, over to South Sudan or Ethiopia or whatever. We've learned through the decades that quite often those tractors might be, you know, scavenged for parts 3 years down the road, right? DOD and USAID has plenty of that kind of experience in the past. The profession of development has really learned you've got to work, again, on buy-in and sustainability and capacity building. And this is another point, I touched on that point of difference between Chinese styles of aid quite often and ours. We work on capacity building, technical assistance, system strengthening, knowledge, getting those ministries, getting those governments, getting those civic society organizations, even getting the private sector all working together in many cases and able to do whatever that is, irrigation project, health project, pandemic care project, education project, whatever, help them learn how to do it, okay? And then here's direct support. That's in some case, we do have to send over some supplies. We do have some times have to give direct support, or direct support is also when we directly fund a government to do this or that work. But anyway, this I think is a good depiction of we're not a giveaway organization. We build capacity, hopefully long-term sustainable capacity. That's the long-term fight that we're in. Because we know anything else, anything just giving away paternalistically to countries is not a long-term solution. You've got to build the capacity. Just real briefly, I like the 3 Ds of foreign policy, of foreign relations, because it's a look at interagency cooperation. It's how U.S. President and Congress does international relations. These are the tools, largely, that a president and the Congress have to do things to affect change internationally. We've got Department of Defense, we've got State Department handling diplomacy, and we've got Development D handled by USAID. And I like it because that puts us on equal footing as a small agency with DOD and State Department. and another look at how we fit into the interagency. Everybody here's heard of DIME, and probably everybody's heard that a lot of people now expand it to be DIME Fill. For example, finance, when the Treasury Department and probably Department of Justice and whoever else is trying to shut down international exchange of the Russian ruble and cripple how Russia's benefiting from its oil sales, you know, that's using the finance tool. So it's important that finance gets added to DIME as a tool for the US government to do what it needs to do internationally. I think it's important to break out development. Sometimes we're tied into economic, but development is such a specific piece of having an impact overseas that I like this model of the whole of government approach Okay. There's a lot going on here, and I'll just highlight a couple things. Development assistance, really quite often a lot of our work is focused on expanding opportunities for economic growth, for people just to basically be able to take care of themselves and their families. And a lot of our work is focused on helping democratic governance happen so that we can work with partners, partner countries that have democracy functioning. The statistics I read now says that about 50% of the countries of the world are democratic or semi-democratic. That's a lot that aren't. And when we help, of course, democracy expand and not retract, as sometimes it is right now with more autocratic governments gaining power, we have more partners that we can work with more effectively. And we facilitate the stabilization of countries by doing those things. And we, of course, are very active in fragile states being countries that are in danger of really not being able to provide services to their people, not being able to implement the basics of an international presence for their country in the geopolitical realm, and breaking down into conflict, civil war, insurrection, violent extremism, whatever. So that's a lot of the countries that we are in. We're in over, as I mentioned, over 100 countries. 66 of them are fragile states or have recently left conflict. And by definition, if you've recently left conflict, you're probably pretty unstable as a country. This is kind of an informal listing here of vulnerabilities that USAID is always working to move the needle from that condition, Pakistan having a terrible, frankly, education system, driving a lot of people into the madrasa system, and then we help develop textbooks and teacher training systems and systems that help the private sector take on the management of public schools, so that they have better education opportunities for their youth bulge, which is in that population of 15 to 29-year-olds, which is the majority of the country, probably 140 million people or something. We need to help them by affecting their system for training those young people with better opportunities. We're trying to move the needle in that one aspect, which is a critical priority for Pakistan and for the stability of Pakistan as a nuclear power and in a strategic part of the world. That's, for example, one investment that USAID makes, trying to move here. All of these then are things that all of our systems, like in that graphic of the circle, of the buckets that we work in, they're all trying to push these vulnerabilities to those better situations that give countries a better chance of staying stable and secure, and hopefully in the long term helping America having more trade partners that are stable. I think talking with you all, and we're all kind of looking at each other's organization, trying to understand how we operate, I thought I'd look at some of the differences between DoD and USAID and similarities. Real quickly, decision making, of course, we're different. I salute the military for the speed and conciseness of decision-making processes that you've perfected. We are very consensus-driven, ground-up driven. Our plans, pick a country, Nigeria, come from the ground up, not from DC. We've got our people that are local nationals of Nigeria that drive a lot of our decision-making, right, Chris? So decision-making at USAID, people like here, Brian and others, Orion, that worked in Afghanistan PRTs, he saw, there could be differences of decision-making culture, right? But it's for a reason. we're very driven by the local needs, the local context, do no harm, and the long-term impact of what we do. So we take more time sometimes in some decisions. But we also have the OFTA and other organizations within USAID that can make fast decisions in disaster response. Anyway, duration of presence in a country gets to the fact that most USAID people are posted to a place 2 to 3 to 4 years. So that's a good long time in a country, and compared to sometimes DoD people sometimes being posted because of what's needed 6 to 12 months. Scale is, of course, we all know, a huge difference between us. Gao, a few years ago, said there was 6,500 military musicians doing very valuable work, recruitment, contributions to American society. That's important, but it just shows the scale that we have 1,700 people like me as foreign service officers, and Chris as foreign service officers working in the 100 countries that we work in. Similarities, but we are more alike than we're different. I hope everybody kind of feels that way. USAID is not an academic organization. We're not a report writing organization. We do it, but we want to have an impact on those countries that we are in. We're in it knee deep in poverty, lack of education, horrible health systems in a lot of these countries, for example. We want to have an impact, and that's where our focus is, just like DoD. I think DoD and USAID always does as much, or always do as much planning and evaluation as possible, even when impact evaluation is tough. We invest in doing impact evaluation of our programs to the extent possible. USAID, bragging for my organization, we are apparently the second most educated workforce in the US government after NASA or some policy agency. So we do emphasize education and training, and we, just like a lot of DoD postings, are in insecure environments. Chris, you just mentioned what countries you've been posted in?
Egypt, South Sudan, Kazakhstan, which was all of the Central Asian countries, and then Sri Lanka.
Yeah. The development security connection, I think that it says a lot that back when the Trump administration was trying to reduce diplomacy investment by slashing like 34% of the, trying to slash the Department of State budget and USAID budget, a whole big number, I can't remember how many, of ex-generals signed a letter saying, you've got to keep your investment as a country in diplomacy and development, because of the balance between diplomacy, development, and military investments that a country needs to make intelligently and in a balanced way. And thankfully for me, also personally, but thankfully for my opinions, Trump was not successful in doing that huge cut. But it was a lot of people like that, and senators saying, hey, USAID, Department of State, they're too important to cut. I like this sentence: development incentives, investments can counteract the political, social, and economic vulnerabilities that contribute to state fragility. Is that an immediate thing? No, but it's working on systems in countries over the long run, so there's less countries that are teetering on the brink of war or falling apart or whatever. And we work on the root causes of violence, like that table that I had here, of those vulnerabilities, those root causes of violence. We open up new opportunities for American business, and we want to create conditions where locally legitimate authorities, like with our governance programs, and anybody that worked with PRTs in either Afghanistan and Iraq probably saw military and USAID officials working on developing the municipal governance capabilities, so that countries can manage conflict, move out of conflict, or stabilize after conflict. Real quickly, DoD and USAID is in a lot of the same areas of the world, doing a lot of the same things. So of course, that's kind of the importance, one of the types of importance of this kind of interagency communication USAID has a big initiative in Africa called Power Africa, which is recognizing that for Africa to be peaceful and have economic opportunities, for a vastly bigger part of its population, it needs electrification. It just needs electricity, and other good things will happen. So USAID is leading a big initiative electrifying good parts of Africa, and DoD has, I'm sure, some investments that relate to that. I'll move on. I saw HIV. Of course, military was very active in and still stays in some parts of the world, active in some of the HIV fights, and development of the health systems in different countries, et cetera. USAID is very well aware that we have to be where DoD is to do this kind of interagency cooperation. So we have high-level folks, of course, in the Pentagon and in all the COCOMs. This is an interesting graphic, I think, for explaining a little bit again about the scale of U.S. foreign assistance and USAID. There's a couple things here. When Americans are asked what percentage of the American national government budget goes to foreign assistance, what do you think most people say? 20%? Yeah. A lot of people say 16, 28%. This is the reality. Slightly less than 1% of the U.S. federal government budget goes to foreign assistance. Now that's not including military expenditures, and then only something around 2/3 of that 1% is administered by USAID. And then, the State Department, for example, has programs helping legal systems in other countries. We do too, but they do also. And then that kind of would be an example of some of that other, part of 1% of U.S. government foreign assistance. Department of Commerce doing some things with financial system, Department, whatever. So that's, I think, important for taxpayers to know that it's not a huge drain on our federal budget development. I hope we all see the value of development work abroad. And again, we're not spending a huge amount of money. I personally think some of the best money we could spend as a national government would be more, of course, I believe that, maybe, but spending more money in development that gives, I think, a good payback back to the United States in trading partners, in reducing conflicts around the world, that kind of thing. So that's our budget there as an agency, the $28 billion, which makes up 2/3 of this. And I'm looking ahead here. Second to the last slide here. We have a lot of things that U.S. military people can do when you're stateside and when you're abroad to tie into USAID expertise, personnel. One thing I'll mention that every USAID mission around the world has a military civilian coordinator, specifically designated to be a liaison between DoD and USAID, okay? So if anybody's posted abroad and wants to know what we do, that person's a good person to touch bases with. Also to find out if there's briefings, needs assessments on the youth population or something in a particular country, or what we're doing in agriculture, or what were the lay of the land in agriculture, in conflict, in political stability or instability, all that kind of thing. We are a source of long-term presence in every country that we are in, that I hope military people will always reach out to us. We also have people, again, that have long-term relationships with the host government, private sector, so reach out to USAID personnel in any country, or people that are based in DC and are studying Africa can find online our 5-year country plans for every country, easily available, open source. and see our strategy in any particular country. It can be helpful. So just some various things that are touch points between DoD and USAID. In April, there is an elective called the Joint Humanitarian Operations course that some of you have maybe taken in the past or heard of, and that is in April here. Sometimes our people out in the field can be a conflict early warning touch point. We sometimes have people, our local staff or our project staff, that hear things. Okay, the Nuar and the Dinka are killed 20 people over here, and then that can be helpful, that local awareness, because we're on the ground. Okay. Sorry, I'm clicking the thing here. Real quickly, I think you've heard me really hammer on, I think instability abroad does lead to insecurity back in the homeland here. We want more partners in the international stage that are peaceful, and we want to keep our trade routes going, et cetera. We're small. We're the second, we're the smallest of the 3Ds and one of the small organizations in the mid-field or dime-filled, but we are in 100 countries, and most of those are in fragile states where DoD has necessarily a lot of attention. We are inherently different from DoD in that we are, as often as possible, looking at root causes, not the symptoms. Not this political leader who is in power today, but how did he or she become the political leader that's disrupting that country? Not that war, that fight over here, but how did that come about, and trying to change the conditions on the ground in that country so that there's less vulnerabilities for countries to go to war, stay at war, or not transition out of war successfully. I've talked about our planning. Our planning our 5-year plans goes into the mission, embassies, integrated country strategies, which is kind of led by the Department of State. And we do coordinate with DoD brothers and sisters, strategically at the COCOMs and DC, operationally in the country team of the agency leaders in any particular country, and then tactically with our project staff, both American and local nationals in any particular country or region. Whew. Thanks, guys, for hanging in there on all that. I know I tried to cover maybe too much, but the most important part is now, I know we have a lot of people that have direct experience with DoD, USAID experience, so please feel free to comment or ask questions now. I'll leave it up to everybody and people that have not had that coordination experience. We've got time now for good questions and comments. I know we have a lot.
I'm just curious how, I'm glad for all of us and stuff, but back when it was formed, whether it was President Kennedy or Congress or whatever, it seems like it's more of a Department of State thing versus DoD thing. How did that come about?
Yeah, how did USAID?
I would think the State Department might say, no, that's us.
Yeah.
DoD, you stay out or whatever. That people might not like that or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how that, maybe if you know that history.
Yeah. And then are you also looking at like present day, we're more aligned with state?
No, I'm just kind of curious about the formation of it,
Yeah.
because it seems more foreign service, but
Yeah.
obviously it's national security, as you explained, and all that. I'm just curious.
Good point. I think that brings up a whole other point. We're kind of in Department of State, and we're kind of not, because we receive our own autonomous funding.
Mm-hmm.
But we're totally aligned. So we're in and out of State Department, I think is okay, politically correct way to say it. So yeah, we work so much with them, but we work so much with DoD. And as to the origins, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but interesting idea.
Yeah, I was really lucky to see that. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Think about that time period with JFK. That was also the time of establishment of the Peace Corps. And the whole thought process is how can we do less military and spend less military if we don't have to go in, if they can fix themselves, then we don't have to do military. I mean, it's kind of an opposite, you know, a lot of that Peace Corps, getting out, even going to the moon, just that whole thing. Let's do less thinking about fighting each other. Let's do more about cooperating with each other, especially when you saw where we were with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you saw us with the Cold War and the two major powers, who was having influence where in the world. How can we influence besides militarily and to be able to make friends rather than enemies? So that was a lot of the drive of this type of thinking. And when you get into countries then and even today, the association of, for example, Dr. Sorensen mentioned being involved in the, not only just the governments, but also with the people themselves. One of the major issues that's been going on since the late 80s is the eradication of polio in the world. And one of the major organizations that's doing that is Rotary International. And so Rotary International teamed with USAID in certain countries. So right now, Pakistan's one of the only countries left that has polio. And so there's a big piece when you get into that health part that he was talking, where USAID is teaming with a service organization, international service organization, with who? With doctors across borders and all of that. Because if you team that with the military, then it's a whole nother situation when you're dealing with Pakistan. So I think you see, it's kind of like, what is the right instrument of power that you can use to inform, influence, and then use this kind of agency that brings the diplomatic and just democratic and governmental advantage, so we don't have to go in with military, which costs way more. If we put more money into this, we could probably get away with putting a whole heck of a lot more money into the military.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I got to see it demonstrated for me very masterfully in Bosnia. I served as the Army Attaché to Bosnia for 2 years during post-conflict reconstruction and got to watch how our U.S. Ambassador, Patrick Moon, at the time, who's been a speaker here before, who was hosted by CGSC Foundation, cooperated with USAID and our offices at DOD and our COCOM. It's really a masterful thing when it goes well, you know, and when the relationships are run well. So I think in terms of like the expressions of national power, USAID it really punches above its weight, and I'm certainly grateful for it. My question for you is a little bit about kind of your experience with agriculture and how USAID deploys agriculture in terms of development. Can you talk a little bit about your history in doing that?
Yeah, well, ag's still a big part of USAID's portfolio around the world. There's countries that have a big portfolio of ag and other countries, of course, that don't have any. So we, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Oh, okay, all right, very good. You know, we're, driven by ag productivity for food security, by economic growth and economic livelihood for the farmers and the whole ag business. We are also influenced in ag work sometimes by climate change considerations. So I think ag is kind of a stable program. It's going to be needed for decades in Africa, for example, whereas a lot of countries have also graduated out of their ag assistance from USAID. It runs the gamut. It's based on local needs. Developing an extension service, developing an irrigation system, but not going in and America expertise designing it, giving technical assistance to the local Ministry of Education of Ag or Ministry of Irrigation sometimes to do things in their system so that they, our programs last you know, a program or project can last a year, it can last 6 years. Chris, as an executive officer, you know, doesn't like to see our initiatives go necessarily on longer than that. So after our funding's done, we want the local ministry or whatever, civil society organization, private sector, whatever, to be able to carry it on. Yeah. Good. Anybody? Yeah.
Why do you think USAID is so minimally funded? I mean, when I'm thinking of military, we spend so much on security cooperation. Anyone in the military that has worked with them agrees, yeah, we should give more money to USAID.
Yeah. There might be other opinions. I think that I'm thankful for the majority of senators and congresspeople pretty much understanding that USA as a country gets a lot back. I think there's sometimes that perception by public, you know, okay, you spent, well, I spend a lot of millions of dollars in Pakistan education's program. There's that resistance. Why are we taxpayers paying for that? Well, A, we have to do our part. As the world's most prosperous country, we've got to do some things in the world's trouble spots and help raise the tides that raise all boats around the world. We're developing trade partners. We're hopefully having some influence on Pakistan staying stable, hopefully having some impact on violent extremism not getting out of control in Pakistan, et cetera. So we get, and you know, we do a lot of trade with Pakistan. So, you know, economically we get a lot back, and I agree. I think we get, just by forgetting our humanitarian role, just thinking about the economic gains that America gets from developing more Taiwans, more Costa Ricas, more Philippines, and countries like that have done pretty well, partly after, largely, you know, not caused by USAID assistance, but you know, we were helpful to a lot of those countries, Korea, you know, back when they were much less developed. So anyway, a lot of benefits come back. Why are we not funded better? I think some of that resistance in tough budget times, and it's easier sometimes to fight a symptom than to realize, hey, root causes, if you invest in it now and fight that root cause of lack of education, lack of governance, lack of good policies in this or that, lack of justice in this country, if we fight that, we might be in a fight for 10 years making any advances, whereas, you know, even in our world, sometimes dropping off the food to Somalia gets some more support because it's the headline in the picture than fighting the root cause. Good question, though. Yeah.
Question for you. The military, we've shifted away from focusing on violent extremists as our top priority with a focus towards large-scale combat operations. The question I'd have for USAID is, how has that shift impacted USAID's decision-making and planning cycles? And then the second part of that is, what about that 5-year transition piece, and how do we nest that between the different combatant commands in our national strategies?
Excellent question, Chris. Chris, feel free to help me if you have any views. You know, to paraphrase some of the question,
yep.
The transition, you know, we've had, the country of U.S. has had to fight violent extremism and the vulnerabilities of countries that have that tendency, right? Africa, Middle East, et cetera, for quite a while now, and there's that transition to, you know, fighting major adversaries. How does that fit into all this? I'm just gonna have to throw out some ideas, frankly. You know, when we're fighting, well, when we're trying to help Ukraine since 1991 with economic growth, with governance, with anti-corruption, with public diplomacy that educates people about the value of open and transparent government, open and transparent private sector operations. When we're doing all that, I think we make Ukraine more resilient to what's happened with the invasion by Russia. Ukraine, you know, has fought back so valiantly, and back in 1991, they were a fledgling new participant in kind of the non-Soviet Union world, right? They needed to learn a lot of things. They needed to develop. And I think part of why their private sector, their IT sector has done such good work fighting the invasion by countering propaganda from Russia, et cetera, is because of the Ukrainian people. But maybe some of our help since '91, helping Ukraine itself develop some of its IT sector, its governance, its anti-corruption efforts, its economic growth, helping get messages out about the advantages of Western democracy, styles of international relations, et cetera. Maybe some of that had some impact on Ukraine. So maybe that's all I'll contribute as sometimes some of our initiatives contribute to the major adversary fight, but in those more longer term approaches of strengthening the regions and the countries that our major enemies could impose themselves upon.
And with
Yeah.
that, unfortunately,
Okay.
Dr. Sorensen has agreed to stay after, but that'll have to wrap this session for this iteration of the InterAgency Brown-Bag. Once again, sir, thank you very much for a great
you all.
presentation and good discussion. I'll remind you, 18 January, please join us for the Federal Executive Board's presentation. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. I'll stay. By the way, always happy to answer any questions. I'm upstairs, and these two emails are not good right now since my laptop is being re-imaged. But my email is marksore@gmail, M-A-R-K, like I have a sore arm. Really appreciate your questions. Please say hi when I pass you in the hall, and let's chat again. Yeah, MARKSORE@gmail, real easy, Mark Sore. Yeah, Chris.
I was just going to say that, like, as the national interest, because we're nestled into the national security strategy just like you are, and so when our national security interests start shifting away from, like Iraq and Afghanistan and the counterterrorism efforts that we were doing there, obviously our budgets and our priorities would shift along with that same national strategy. And so with the 2022, we're going to see a lot more resources going to probably the post-Soviet world, and of course always the Indo-Pacific strategy countries.
If I may, one thing for the students, from my experience and time, as you guys are getting ready to go out and do whatever you're going to do, so I'm seeing various patches on the right shoulder and tabs and stuff. Two areas where I crossed with USAID in good ways, not like friction crossed, right? But where we crossed paths. On the tactical side, the Battalion XO in country, obviously where there's a conflict, they were on the ground, coming in and out, quite a bit, and we're supporting them through whatever it may be, QRF or any kind of ISR, ensuring things are set, established, but working with that. And before that happened, guess who is meeting with the interagency partners, right? Battalion XO, right, or maybe the 3. The other one, more recent in my time, when I was at the Erbil Consulate as the senior military advisor / military official up there, okay, with the U.S. Consulate General, as they were trying to synergize effect with the Kurds in that region. There were, a couple big players at the table. Now, we each have our own, like I had a $261 million FMF portfolio or FMS portfolio, right? USAID is bringing their thing to the table too, right? And, within State Department doing their thing. That lead diplomatic mission was trying to kind of help coordinate and bring things in concert with each other for it. And so, yes, we had a seat at the big table equal to them. Okay, and then as well as, like the Paul Econ chief in that case with the country team. So where you can also find them, not just on the ground, where you may, in passing on the tactical side, as Dr. Sorensen had in the slides, but in those embassies, those consulates as well. So that's where you guys may experience them.
Cool. Anything else? I'll let anybody that has any comments or questions, stay on. I'll stay around a while, but good luck with your holiday season. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.